So I recently got a message, and I think it actually points to a much bigger leadership problem that exists in a lot of workplaces. And I get versions of this message pretty frequently where the person described a workplace where the leadership was what they called nano-managing. That's not micromanaging, that's nano-managing, where successful outcomes were ignored, where expectations were vague, and where they somehow became responsible for peers not meeting expectations even though they weren't involved in their work. And there's one line that really stood out to me in the message was that they said this was literally written on the director's wall as their form of management. And that's concerning because I think that there are actually a couple different things happening in situations like this. One of the biggest things is good old-fashioned confirmation bias. This is one of those things that I think that the leadership culture and the thought leadership culture massively underestimates. The reality is our brains, your brain, my brain, constantly lie to us, especially about people or things we don't like. And sometimes you don't even fully understand why you dislike someone. Your brain just starts to build a story around them, and then every interaction becomes evidence that that story was right all along. That's confirmation bias. And this is one of those traps that can make leadership really difficult. Your biases don't just affect you, they affect the people you're responsible for. So an uncomfortable reality is that every leader and every person has their biases, every single one. And being a good leader doesn't mean that you're pretending to be perfectly objective. It means that you're willing to investigate your own reactions and ask whether they're actually fair. Now, I know people like Brené Brown talk a lot about assuming best intentions and avoiding the shitty first drafts. And I think those ideas can be really helpful, especially when you're dealing with people who are actually intellectually curious and capable of self-reflection. But I also think there is a limit to blindly assuming good intentions when someone's actions are repeatedly telling you a very different story. At some point, you have to evaluate the pattern and not just live on hopes. So one of the deeper issues here is not simply everyone should assume best intentions, it's understanding that your perception itself could be flawed. Because leadership requires intellectual self-awareness. You have to constantly ask, am I reacting to what this person actually did? Or am I reacting to the narrative that I've already created about them? And I've led people who I personally did not like. Years ago, I worked at this backcountry adventure camp where I take wealthy kids into the wilderness for long expeditions. And some of those kids were great, and some of those kids were objectively brats. But even at 20 years old, I understood something pretty important. My job was not to emotionally approve of them. My job was to keep them safe, lead them fairly, make good decisions around them, even though they annoyed me. And this is where a lot of workplaces fail this test. Now, the second thing I kept hearing in this message was a pattern of role stripping. And the reason I say that is because the person is describing what sounds like the systems where responsibility kept expanding, but their authority kept shrinking. And that is a huge red flag. If you're being blamed for a peer that you don't supervise, if expectations are constantly moving, if feedback is vague, or if your actual work is ignored while you're spending all your time and energy defending yourself, that's not accountability anymore. It's just a form of control. And here's where the psychology behind this gets a little weird. The harder people try to explain themselves in a system like this, the guiltier they often look. If you've ever played a social deduction game, you might have seen this play out. The more someone tries to prove that they aren't the bad guy, the more suspicious everybody around them becomes. They start asking questions like, why are they trying so hard? And unfortunately, that dynamic exists in workplaces. So once someone in leadership is leaning into that confirmation bias and deciding who someone is, every future interaction gets filtered through that story. And that's why people in these environments often feel gaslit. It's not because leadership is necessarily consciously malicious. Sometimes it's just because leadership has stopped questioning their own assumptions. If you find yourself in those situations, you usually cannot argue someone into becoming self-reflective. You can't force someone to intellectual curiosity, especially if they emotionally already benefit from what they already seem to want to believe. I want to be a little careful here because I don't think the answer is to assume everyone's evil. But I do think that leaders have a responsibility to build systems that challenge their own blind spots instead of reinforcing them. And that's going to mean documenting expectations clearly, giving consistent feedback, checking whether standards are being applied equally, and actually asking yourself whether you would react differently if someone else had done the exact same thing. Because leadership is not just managing people, leadership is managing your own perceptions responsibly. So for the employees that are dealing with this kind of environment, I wish I had a very clear answer as to what to do. Because people really do want validation. They want leadership to finally understand them, and they want the truth to finally win. But sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is to just recognize the pattern as early as possible. And then document everything, protect your mental health, pay attention to the inconsistency, pay attention to whether you are constantly feeling like you are explaining who you are instead of letting your work speak for yourself. The reality is that lazy thinkers and lazy leaders are going to create enormous mental labor for the people around them. And eventually that could start affecting your mental health. No one should have to leave a workplace because people in leadership are refusing to examine their own assumptions. But unfortunately, this happens all the time. If you constantly feel like you're defending your own reality instead of just simply doing your job, there's a good chance you're already in a very unhealthy system. Thank you for watching. Let me know if you identify with this or if you've seen this in the comments. Thanks, y'all.